A brutal snowstorm had swallowed the forest that morning, turning everything white and silent, until a scream, small, sharp, and desperate, echoed through the trees. 8-year-old Lily froze mid-step, her breath fogging the air. Her police dog, Shadow, suddenly stiffened. His ears shot up, his nose twitched. Then, he bolted. "Shadow! Wait!" Lily cried, chasing after him. But Shadow wasn't running randomly. He was tracking something. Moments later, Lily stumbled into a clearing and gasped. Two police officers were buried in the snow, only their heads visible, their faces bruised, their mouths taped shut. They weren't moving. Shadow barked frantically, digging through the snow like his life depended on it. How did they get there? Who did this to them? And how did a little girl and her loyal dog become the only reason these two officers survived? What happened next shocked everyone. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The storm had started before sunrise, turning the quiet town into a world of white. Trees bent under the heavy snow, and the wind howled like it was warning people to stay inside. But Emily had never been the kind of child who feared the cold. Her tiny boots crunched through the fresh snow as she followed the narrow trail behind her house. Beside her, Shadow, the family's German shepherd trained by a local officer, walked with calm confidence. He always stayed close, watching every step she took, like her silent protector. Emily loved mornings like this. The air felt sharp, clean, and still. She giggled every time Shadow stuck his nose into the snow and sneezed, but today felt different. The woods were unusually quiet. No birds, no rustling branches, no distant animal sounds. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath for a moment. Emily noticed it too. She stopped walking and looked around, her small hands tucked inside her mittens. "Shadow, it's too quiet," she whispered. The dog's ears lifted, his posture straightening. The calmness he carried moments earlier faded, replaced by a sudden alertness. Shadow took a few steps forward, sniffing the air with slow, deliberate breaths. His tail stiffened. Emily recognized this behavior. She had seen it before when police visited their home for training sessions. Shadow only acted like this when something wasn't right. Her heart fluttered with uneasiness. She reached out and touched his back. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly. But Shadow didn't respond. He moved ahead, nose buried in the snow, tracing an invisible trail Emily couldn't see. The dog's pace quickened, and Emily hurried behind him, struggling to keep up. The path grew thicker with snow the deeper they went. Emily's boots sank with every step, slowing her down, but Shadow kept pulling forward, driven by something she didn't understand. She felt a knot forming in her stomach. She had only seen Shadow this focused when he was searching for something important. Never during their morning walks. "Shadow, wait!" she called out. But the dog didn't stop. Instead, he barked, one sharp, urgent bark that echoed through the silent forest like a warning. Emily froze for a moment, her breath fogging in the air. Something terrible had to be ahead. She couldn't explain how she knew. She just felt it. The storm, the silence, Shadow's sudden panic. None of it made sense. She swallowed hard, then started running, her small legs shaking with fear. And as she followed Shadow deeper into the trees, Emily had no idea that within minutes, her life was about to change forever. Shadow suddenly stopped at the edge of a fallen pine tree, his body stiff as a statue. The wind blew snow across his fur, but he didn't even blink. Emily slowed down, panting softly, and wiped her forehead. "Shadow?" "What is it?" she whispered, but the dog didn't look back. Instead, he lowered his head again, sniffing the ground in tight circles. His breathing grew harsher, faster, like he had picked up a scent that didn't belong in the forest. Emily watched him nervously, her fingers gripping her jacket. A moment later, Shadow's entire posture changed. His ears shot up, and a deep, low growl rumbled from his chest. Emily's heart jumped. Shadow never growled unless he sensed danger, not just an animal or another person, but something serious. The growl rose again, louder this time, echoing between the trees. Emily took a hesitant step back. The cold suddenly felt sharper, biting through her coat. She had come here thinking it would be another peaceful walk, but the fear crawling up her spine told her this day was different. Shadow moved forward again, more urgently now. He was no longer sniffing. He was tracking. His paws cut through the snow quickly as he followed a path Emily couldn't see. The little girl hurried after him, stumbling as her boots sank deeper. "Shadow, slow down," she pleaded, but he didn't listen. His training had taken over. Something ahead had his full attention. Something important enough to make him ignore everything else. Even Emily's voice. She felt tears sting her eyes from the cold and worry. The wind shifted suddenly, blowing a strong, icy gust through the trees. Shadow froze again. This time his head jerked upward, and he sniffed the air intensely. Then to Emily's shock, he barked, a loud, sharp cry filled with urgency. He looked at her, eyes wide and alert, as if telling her to follow him no matter what. Emily didn't question it. She nodded quickly, even though her hands were trembling. She trusted Shadow more than anyone. If he said something was wrong, she believed him. Without warning, Shadow bolted toward a cluster of snow-covered bushes. Emily ran after him, forcing her small legs to move faster. Her breath came out in quick, shaky clouds. She didn't know what Shadow had found, but the fear in her chest kept growing. She pushed through the bushes, branches scratching her coat, and finally caught up, just as Shadow stopped dead in his tracks. Emily gasped. Ahead of them, the snow looked disturbed, pressed down, almost like something or someone had been there. Emily's eyes widened as she stepped closer, her boots sinking into the uneven snow. At first, she couldn't understand what she was seeing. The white surface looked disturbed, flattened as if someone had been struggling there. Shadow sniffed violently, moving in frantic circles until he suddenly stopped beside what looked like a small mound. He whimpered, pawing at it. Emily hesitated, her breath shaking, then bent down. Her mitten brushed against something firm, something human. Her heart jumped painfully inside her chest. "Shadow, is that?" she whispered, voice cracking. Shadow barked sharply, digging his paws into the snow with desperation. Emily dropped to her knees and began scraping away the thick layer of ice with her hands. The cold burned her skin through her mittens, but she didn't stop. A moment later, a dark blue uniform appeared beneath the snow. Emily froze again. A police officer's uniform. Her breathing quickened, and she looked around anxiously. Snowflakes landed on her eyelashes, melting instantly, but she barely felt the cold anymore. She pushed more snow away until a face emerged. A man's face, bruised, motionless. His eyes were closed, lips tinted blue. A strip of duct tape covered his mouth. Emily felt her stomach twist. She had never seen anything like this before. "Shadow, he's hurt," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Shadow nudged the officer's shoulder gently, then barked again, louder this time, a desperate, urgent cry. Emily knew what Shadow was trying to tell her. This man wasn't dead, not yet. He needed help. But as she reached out to shake his arm, her hand brushed against another mound of snow on the opposite side. Something about the shape made her stop. Slowly, cautiously, Emily crawled toward it. Shadow followed, stepping protectively beside her. She brushed the snow away again, her hands trembling. Within seconds, another uniform appeared. This time, a woman's face surfaced, swollen, bruised, just like the first officer. Emily gasped and covered her mouth. 2 officers, both buried, both barely alive. Fear clamped around her chest like an iron grip. Who did this? Why here, in the middle of the woods? And were they still in danger? Shadow growled softly, scanning the trees, his body rigid with tension. Emily touched the woman's arm, shaking it gently. "Please, wake up. Please," she whispered. The woman didn't move. The silence felt heavier now, pressing against Emily from all sides. She looked at Shadow again, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" But Shadow had already made his decision. He planted himself between the officers and the trees, growling deeper, louder, warning everything hidden in the forest that he was ready to fight. Emily swallowed hard. She wanted to run home, to hide under blankets, to pretend she hadn't seen any of this. But she couldn't leave the officers to die. Not now. Not here. Emily's hands were shaking so hard she could barely brush the snow off her gloves. She looked from one officer to the other, her chest tight with fear. "Shadow, we have to help them," she whispered, though her voice wavered. The German shepherd stood guard, muscles tense, eyes fixed on the trees. Emily dropped beside the first officer again and carefully pulled away more snow from his coat. His face was ice cold, and for a moment she feared he wasn't breathing. She leaned closer, trying to listen through the howling wind. A faint, shallow breath escaped his lips. Relief washed over her, but it lasted only a second. They were alive, but barely. Emily tried removing the tape from his mouth, tugging at the frozen edges. Her little fingers struggled, the adhesive stiff from the cold. She pulled again, her mitten scraping against the officer's cheek. Finally, the tape loosened. The man coughed weakly, a painful, broken sound. "Sir, can you hear me?" Emily asked, but he didn't respond. She turned toward the female officer, her heart pounding. She couldn't lose them, not while they still had a chance. Emily crawled to the second mound and began uncovering the woman's face, brushing snow away with urgency. The bruises looked worse up close, dark, swollen, raw. Emily bit her lip, fighting the urge to cry. She tugged at the tape around the woman's mouth, carefully peeling it off. The woman flinched slightly. It was the tiniest movement, but it gave Emily hope. "You're going to be okay," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She knew she needed to warm them, protect them from freezing, but she was just a child. All she had was Shadow, and he was already doing everything he could. Shadow suddenly barked, a deep warning bark that echoed through the trees. Emily's head snapped up, her heart racing. She didn't see anything, but Shadow's instincts were sharper than hers. Something or someone was nearby. She moved closer to the officers, placing herself between them like she could shield them, even though she was terrified. "Shadow, don't leave me," she whispered. He didn't. He simply stepped forward, positioning himself protectively, his fur bristling, his growl low and steady. The wind picked up again, blowing snow across the clearing. Emily felt colder now, not from the weather but from fear. She knew they couldn't stay here forever. The officers needed help, real help, and fast. But she didn't have a phone. No one knew they were here, and the storm was growing worse by the minute. Emily swallowed, pushing back her tears. "Please wake up," she whispered to the officers. "Please, tell me what to do." But the woods stayed silent, and Emily realized something terrifying. She was the only conscious person for miles, and 2 lives depended on her. Emily wiped her tears with the back of her mitten and forced herself to look around. The snow around the officers wasn't just disturbed. It was torn apart, like there had been a struggle. Footprints, half covered by the storm, circled the area in frantic patterns. Some were deep, showing someone had been dragged. Emily shivered, not from the cold but from fear. Who would do this to police officers? She followed one set of tracks with her eyes and realized it led deeper into the woods, fading into the thick white fog. Shadow's behavior grew more intense. He sniffed one of the footprints, then growled louder than before, his tail stiff, ears pinned back. Emily had seen him trained to track suspects, but today his reaction felt different, more primal, more afraid. She touched his back gently. "Shadow, did someone hurt them?" The German shepherd didn't look at her. Instead, he lowered his head and followed the trail a few steps before stopping abruptly. His growl deepened, vibrating through the ground. Whatever scent he picked up, it wasn't just danger, it was evil. Emily turned her attention back to the officers. She noticed something she hadn't seen earlier. Zip ties half buried under the snow, cut roughly as if the officers had tried to free themselves. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't an accident. Someone had tied them up, dragged them here, and tried to bury them alive. She felt her breath quicken, her chest tightening. "Why here?" she whispered. "Why in the woods?" The silence offered no answers. Only the storm responded, blowing another wave of snow across the clearing. Shadow suddenly paced in a tight circle, whining softly. His nose twitched in every direction, picking up scents Emily couldn't understand. Then he froze again, staring at a patch of snow near the fallen tree. Emily crawled toward it, brushing the surface away and gasped. A fresh smear of blood streaked across the ice. Not frozen, not old. Shadow. This happened recently, she whispered, her voice trembling. Shadow stepped in front of her protectively, his eyes fixed on the trees. He sensed something alive nearby, something watching. Emily hugged herself, trying to stay brave. She glanced at the officers, their breathing weak, their bodies still. They needed warmth, help, anything, but she had nothing. No blanket, no phone, no adults. Only Shadow. She placed her hand on his fur. We can't leave them, she whispered, her voice shaky but determined. Shadow didn't move. Instead, he lifted his head, sniffed the icy air again, and let out a sudden, sharp bark. Not a warning this time, a signal. Someone else was here. Emily jerked her head toward the male officer when she heard a faint groan. His eyelids fluttered weakly, then squeezed shut as if even the dim light hurt him. Emily crawled closer, her knees sinking into the cold snow. Sir, can you hear me? She whispered, her voice trembling. The officer's fingers twitched. His lips parted, releasing a shaky breath. He was alive, but his face twisted with pain, and every breath seemed like a battle. Emily leaned closer, desperate to help in any way she could. The officer forced one eye open, his gaze unfocused. Guy, go, he rasped, the words barely audible. Emily shook her head quickly. No, I can't leave you. You're hurt. His breathing hitched, and he lifted his hand a fraction of an inch, pointing weakly toward the woods. Run, he whispered. He's still here. Emily felt her blood run cold. She glanced over her shoulder, suddenly terrified of the trees surrounding them. Shadow growled softly, confirming the officer's words without saying anything at all. Danger hadn't passed. Emily shifted to the female officer next. The woman's face twitched as Emily brushed snow from her cheek. Her lashes fluttered. A weak gasp escaped her lips. Emily gently squeezed her hand. Ma'am, please wake up, she whispered. The woman's breathing grew shallow but steady. Slowly, painfully, she opened her eyes just enough to see Emily's tiny, scared face. Recognition flickered in her gaze. You need help, she breathed. Emily nodded quickly, though tears pooled in her eyes. I know, I just don't know how. The woman winced, trying to raise her head, but the effort made her gasp in pain. Radio, she whispered. Emily leaned in. What radio? The officer gestured weakly toward her vest. Emily fumbled with the pockets, her numb fingers struggling until she finally found a small radio. Cracked, covered in snow, but still intact. She held it up with hope. Before she could speak into it, the officer grabbed Emily's wrist gently. Be careful, she whispered. He's close. Emily swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her ears. Shadow suddenly stepped forward, his bark exploding through the quiet clearing. Emily froze, gripping the radio tightly. The male officer's eyes snapped open wider, filled with fear. Hide, he croaked, struggling to push himself up. Emily looked around wildly, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The storm howled louder, the trees shaking violently. Shadow's fur bristled as he positioned himself between them and the woods, his growl deep and threatening. Emily clutched the radio to her chest. The officers were awake, but their warning came too late. Someone else was already watching them. Emily's breath caught in her throat as Shadow's growl grew deeper, vibrating through the frozen air. The German shepherd stood perfectly still, staring into the thick wall of trees with a focus Emily had never seen before. His ears were upright, tail stiff, every muscle tense like a drawn bow. Emily followed his gaze, but the woods were nothing but darkness and blowing snow. Still, something inside her whispered that they were no longer alone. The officer's warnings echoed in her mind, sending a cold shiver down her spine. The male officer tried lifting his head again, wincing as pain shot through his body. Hide, he whispered urgently, his voice cracking. Emily shook her head helplessly. Where? There's nowhere to go. She scanned the clearing, but the woods stretched endlessly in every direction. Before she could say another word, Shadow stepped forward and barked, loud, sharp, commanding. The sound thundered through the silent forest. The snow-covered branches trembled, and for a moment, everything went still again. Then, there was movement, a faint crunch of snow, slow, heavy, deliberate. Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. Her knees felt weak. She clutched the radio tightly, as if it could protect her. Shadow advanced a few steps, no longer growling but completely focused, waiting for the figure to reveal itself. Another crunch sounded, then another. The attacker wasn't rushing. He wasn't hiding. He was walking toward them confidently, like he believed no one could stop him. Emily swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She heard her own heartbeat louder than the wind. The female officer whispered, "Don't look at him. Stay low." But Emily couldn't move. Through the curtain of falling snow, a shape finally emerged. A tall figure dressed in dark clothing, face partly hidden under a hood. He stopped several feet away, standing still like a shadow carved from the storm. Emily froze. The man didn't speak. He didn't make a sound. He just stared at the scene before him, the officers struggling to breathe, the terrified little girl, the growling canine ready to protect her with his life. Then slowly, almost mockingly, the man tilted his head, like he was amused that they were still alive. Shadow barked again, stepping forward with a fierce lunge that made the man stop in his tracks. Emily gasped, backing up instinctively. The attacker's hand twitched toward his pocket, and Shadow responded instantly, baring his teeth, lowering his body, ready to strike. The tension in the clearing became suffocating. Emily could barely breathe. She didn't know what the man wanted or why he had attacked the officers, but she understood one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't finished. Emily's legs trembled as she crouched beside the officers, her breath coming out in short, terrified puffs. She wanted to run, scream, hide, anything, but her eyes stayed locked on Shadow. He stood between her and the attacker like an unbreakable wall. His fur bristled, teeth bared, every instinct ready for battle. Emily pressed one hand against the officer's arm, trying to steady herself. "Shadow, please be careful," she whispered, her voice trembling. The dog didn't look back. He didn't need to. He already knew what he had to do. The attacker took a slow step forward, testing Shadow's reaction. The dog lunged instantly, growling with a force that echoed through the snow-covered forest. The man paused again, lifting both hands slightly, a gesture Emily couldn't read. Was he calming the dog, mocking it, or preparing to grab something? Emily's heart pounded against her ribs. "Go inside," the female officer whispered weakly, pointing to a hollow under the fallen tree. Emily shook her head fiercely. "No, I won't leave Shadow. I won't leave you." Her voice cracked, but her resolve didn't. The attacker's voice finally broke through the storm, cold, raspy, almost amused. "Brave little girl," he muttered, taking another step forward. Shadow barked again, louder, fiercer, forcing the man to stop. Emily forced herself to stand, her knees wobbling. She took one step forward, placing herself closer to Shadow. The attacker tilted his head at her boldness, his eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Emily swallowed hard, fear clawing inside her chest. "And you shouldn't hurt people," she whispered back, surprising even herself with her courage. The man let out a quiet laugh, but there was no warmth in it. "You think that dog can save you?" he taunted. Emily didn't blink. "He already did," she said softly, "and he'll do it again." Shadow growled louder, lowering his body, ready to launch at the slightest threat. Emily tightened her grip on the cracked radio. The officers were too weak to defend themselves. Shadow was their only protection, and she was Shadow's only backup. The attacker shifted his stance, snow crunching under his boot. Emily flinched but stood her ground. The wind howled harder, blowing snow between them like a swirling white curtain. For a moment, Emily feared the man would charge, and everything inside her screamed for help. She squeezed the radio, praying it would work. The attacker moved his hand slightly, and Shadow leapt forward with a warning bark so powerful the man stepped back. Emily took the chance, lifting the radio to her mouth. Even though her hands shook, her voice came out clear. "Please, someone, help us." The attacker's expression hardened the moment Emily lifted the radio. His calm, mocking posture vanished. "Put that down," he growled, taking a fast step forward. Emily stumbled back, gripping the device tighter. Shadow reacted instantly, charging ahead with a fierce bark that ripped through the cold air. The man jerked his hand from his pocket, revealing a metal rod, its edges sharp and cold. Emily gasped. Shadow didn't hesitate. He lunged with full force, knocking the man off balance. The sound of bodies colliding echoed across the frozen clearing. The attacker hit the ground but rolled quickly to his feet, swinging the rod wildly. Shadow dodged, snarling, his teeth snapping dangerously close to the man's wrist. Emily watched in horror as the fight unfolded. Fast, brutal, real. Snow flew everywhere as dog and attacker circled each other. The man swung again, and this time the rod clipped Shadow's shoulder. The dog yelped, but didn't back down. Instead, he came back fiercer, launching himself forward and pushing the man several steps back. Emily screamed, "Shadow, look out!" The attacker raised the rod high, ready to strike again. Shadow darted sideways, moving with trained precision. He lunged at the man's arm, sinking his teeth into the thick sleeve, forcing the weapon to drop into the snow. The rod clattered to the ground. The man roared in anger, grabbing Shadow's fur and trying to pry him off. Shadow held firm, using all his strength to keep the attacker restrained. Emily's legs wobbled, but she kept the radio close to her mouth, pressing the button again. "Please, we need help! 2 officers down! Attacker still here!" Her voice shook but remained loud. The man finally wrenched free, stumbling backward. Shadow growled, preparing for another attack. But the man didn't retreat. He charged forward with raw fury, tackling Shadow to the ground. The two rolled violently, snow spraying around them. Shadow barked, teeth flashing, claws digging into the snow. The attacker grabbed a handful of ice and slammed it into the dog's face. Shadow recoiled for a second, but 1 second was enough for the man to scramble toward the fallen rod. Emily's heart lurched. "No!" she cried, running forward before she could stop herself. The attacker's fingers curled around the rod just as Shadow lunged again, knocking him sideways. The weapon flew out of reach. Emily froze mid-step, realizing how close she had come to danger. Shadow planted himself between her and the man, chest heaving, teeth bared. The attacker glared at Emily with cold hatred. "You should have stayed home," he sneered. Shadow barked once. Loud, powerful, unwavering. And the battle wasn't over. Emily's hands trembled so violently she almost dropped the radio, but she forced herself to hold it steady. Shadow and the attacker circled each other again, both exhausted but refusing to give in. The man lunged forward, slipping slightly on the ice, and Shadow darted out of reach just in time. Emily knew the officers couldn't move. They couldn't defend themselves. If she didn't get help now, none of them would survive. She pressed the radio button hard, praying the static would break. "Please," she whispered. "Anyone, hear me." A burst of static crackled through the speaker, loud enough to make her flinch. Then, a faint voice. "Hello? Who's transmitting?" Emily gasped, her heart leaping. She pressed the button again. "This is Emily. Officers hurt. Man attacking us." Her voice was breathless, sharp with fear. The radio hissed again. "Emily, slow down. What location?" She looked around helplessly. The woods looked the same in every direction. I don't know. Near the North Trail. Toward the old Pine Bridge." She hoped that meant something to them. Shadow barked again as the attacker swung a fist toward him. The voice crackled urgently. "Units dispatched. Stay hidden. Stay low. K9 support en route." Emily's breath shook with relief. Help was coming. Real help. She clutched the radio tightly, whispering, "Please hurry." Before she could say more, the attacker snapped his head toward her, eyes blazing with fury. "Who told you to talk?" he snarled, charging forward. Emily froze. Shadow reacted instantly, launching himself at the man with such force the attacker stumbled back into the snow. The radio slipped from Emily's hand, but she grabbed it again quickly, tucking it into her coat. Shadow pushed forward, driving the man away from Emily. Their struggle grew more desperate, more vicious. The man grabbed a handful of snow and shoved it in Shadow's face again, trying to blind him. Shadow shook it off, refusing to back down. Emily felt tears sting her eyes. She couldn't fight. She couldn't run. But she could help. She scanned the ground until her eyes locked onto the metal rod half buried in the snow. She slid toward it carefully, praying the attacker wouldn't notice her moving. Her mitten brushed the rod. She hesitated, terrified, but picked it up anyway. It felt heavy, cold, wrong in her small hands. She didn't want to hurt anyone, but she had to protect Shadow. She took a shaky breath, ready to throw it if she had to. Shadow barked, pushing the man farther away. Emily clutched the rod tightly, whispering to herself, "Be brave, be brave." And for the first time that day, she truly believed she could be. Emily crouched low, clutching the metal rod tightly, her breath trembling in the icy air. Shadow and the attacker were locked in a vicious struggle, snow flying, growls echoing through the woods. The man shoved Shadow hard, trying to break free, but the dog lunged again, refusing to let him near Emily or the officers. Suddenly, through the storm's howl, Emily heard something. Distant at first, then clearer. Sirens. Faint but unmistakable. Her heart leaped. "Shadow, they're coming," she whispered, though Shadow couldn't look away from his opponent. The attacker heard the sirens too. His head jerked toward the sound, panic flickering across his face for the first time. "No, no, not now," he muttered angrily. He spun back toward Emily, his eyes full of rage, as if blaming her for the incoming help. He lunged forward. Emily gasped and stumbled backward in the snow, gripping the rod like a lifeline. But Shadow intercepted him. Slamming into the man with all his remaining strength, the attacker hit the ground hard, groaning, and Shadow stood over him, teeth bared, chest heaving. The trees lit up with flashing red and blue as patrol cars neared the trail entrance. Multiple voices shouted commands, officers running, boots crunching against the snow. Emily felt tears of relief slide down her cheeks. "Over here!" she cried, waving her arm frantically. The attacker scrambled to his feet, desperation making his movements wild. He saw the lights, the uniforms, the guns, and he bolted. He spun toward the woods, ready to disappear into the storm. But Shadow wasn't done. With a fierce bark, Shadow chased after him, kicking up snow as he sprinted. Emily watched in fear and awe as the dog darted between trees and closing the distance quickly. The attacker glanced back, slipped on the ice and crashed into a fallen branch. Shadow leapt, tackling him to the ground again. This time the man didn't escape. Officers rushed in seconds later, shouting warnings. "Don't move! Hands where we can see them!" The attacker tried one last time to crawl away, but Shadow growled sharply, forcing him still. Two officers grabbed the man, pinning him down and wrestling him into cuffs. Emily exhaled shakily, dropping the rod into the snow. Shadow returned to her side moments later, exhausted but victorious. His fur was covered in snow, and he trembled from both cold and adrenaline. Emily wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his neck. "You did it! You're amazing," she whispered, voice shaking. Shadow nuzzled her gently, as if reassuring her he was all right. More officers reached the clearing, surrounding the injured pair on the ground. Emily stepped back, letting the professionals take over. She watched as medics knelt beside the frozen, battered officers. For the first time since entering the woods, she felt safe. Help had arrived. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. The truth still needed to be uncovered. Emily stood close to Shadow as more officers arrived, their voices sharp and urgent. Medics worked quickly on the injured pair, wrapping blankets around them, checking vitals, and preparing stretchers. The storm still raged, but now the woods felt alive with flashing lights and footsteps. Emily watched everything silently, trying to make sense of the chaos. The female officer's eyes fluttered open again. She searched the crowd weakly until she found Emily. A faint, grateful smile touched her bruised lips. "You saved us," she whispered. Emily shook her head softly. "Shadow did." A detective knelt beside the injured male officer, speaking gently. "Can you tell us what happened?" The officer winced, his voice raspy but determined. "We were tracking him, robbery suspect, armed." He paused for breath, his chest rising and falling painfully. "He ambushed us, took our radios, zip-tied us, dragged us here." Emily felt her stomach twist. She had seen the drag marks, but hearing his voice break describing it made her chest tighten. The officer continued, he said, "No one would ever find us. Buried us under the snow. Left us to freeze." The female officer nodded weakly, tears pooling at the corners of her eyes. "He wanted revenge," she whispered. "We arrested his brother last month. Violent case. He blamed us." Her voice cracked. "He wasn't supposed to be out here." The detective frowned deeply. "He targeted you intentionally?" The woman nodded again. "Yes, he followed us during patrol, waited until we were alone, then attacked." Emily hugged Shadow tighter, realizing how close they had come to finding two bodies instead of two survivors. Shadow whined softly, sensing her distress. Another officer approached the detective hurriedly. "We checked his truck, weapons inside, rope, food supplies. He was planning to hide out for days." Emily trembled. If she and Shadow hadn't walked into the woods that morning, no one would have known where the officers were. The female officer squeezed Emily's hand gently. "You were our miracle," she whispered. Emily blinked away tears. "I just wanted to help." The male officer smiled weakly. "You didn't just help. You saved our lives." Emily lowered her head, overwhelmed. The detective stood and looked around the clearing. "We need to move them fast. Hypothermia is setting in." Medics nodded, lifting the stretchers carefully. Emily stepped back with Shadow, watching as the officers were carried toward the rescue vehicles. Despite the fear and chaos, one feeling settled heavily in her heart: relief. They were alive. But as she glanced back toward the dark forest, she couldn't shake the thought that echoed in her mind. If Shadow hadn't sensed something was wrong, no one would have come in time. As the medics carried the officers toward the trail entrance, the remaining police secured the area, marking the footprints, drag marks, and blood-stained patches in the snow. Emily watched quietly, her hand resting on Shadow's back. The German shepherd stood alert despite his exhaustion. His chest rose and fell heavily, but his eyes stayed sharp, scanning the woods the same way he had when everything began. An officer approached Emily, kneeling beside her. "You're very brave," he said gently. "But that dog, he's something extraordinary." Emily nodded proudly. "He always knows." Just then, another radio call came through, urgent and tense. "Suspect attempted escape once cuffed. He's running toward the East Ridge." Emily's heart lurched. The attacker had slipped away again. Officers sprinted toward the ridge, shouting commands, snow crunching under their boots. Emily felt panic surge through her. "No, he can't get away," she whispered. Shadow's ears perked instantly. Without waiting for anyone's command, he bolted forward, leaving a trail of paw prints behind him. "Shadow!" Emily called, but her voice was drowned by the wind. Officers shouted after him, but the dog was already gone. Shadow raced through the trees with fearless precision, following the man's scent as if it were a glowing trail in the snow. The attacker limped ahead, leaving splashes of blood behind him. His fight with Shadow had taken a toll. He looked over his shoulder and cursed when he saw the dog gaining on him. "Stay back!" he shouted, tripping over a fallen branch. But Shadow didn't slow. He darted around the trees, powerful muscles propelling him through the deep snow. Within seconds, he launched himself forward, knocking the man onto his back. The attacker struggled, swinging his arms wildly, but Shadow's training kicked in. He grabbed the man's thick jacket sleeve, not biting flesh, just restraining, holding him down with immense strength. The man kicked, yelled, cursed, but he couldn't break free. Officers burst through the trees moments later, guns drawn. "Don't move!" one shouted. "Hands where we can see them!" Shadow stepped back only when one officer placed a hand on his neck, signaling the fight was over. They pinned the attacker, cuffed him properly this time, and dragged him to his feet. One officer exhaled in awe. If it weren't for this dog, he'd be gone again. Emily reached the scene moments later, breathless, cheeks red from the cold. Shadow ran to her, tail wagging weakly, and she fell to her knees, wrapping her arms around him. "You did it! Again!" she whispered. Tears warmed her eyes despite the freezing air. Officers exchanged glances of respect and disbelief. A little girl and her loyal K9 had done what an entire search team couldn't. Shadow hadn't just saved the officers' lives, He had delivered justice too. Emily waited anxiously inside the warm glow of the hospital lobby, her small hands wrapped around a cup of hot chocolate a nurse had given her. Shadow lay beside her chair, resting his head on her boots, finally relaxing after the long fight. Snow still clung to his thick fur, but his breathing was steady now. Emily gently stroked his ears, whispering, "You were so brave today." Shadow let out a soft, tired whine, as if telling her he simply did what he had to do. Still, the weight of the day lingered heavily on them both. After what felt like hours, a doctor approached with a reassuring smile. "Emily?" he said softly. She stood up quickly, Shadow rising alongside her. "They're both stable," the doctor continued. "Hypothermia, bruises, broken ribs, but they're going to recover." Emily's chest loosened with relief. Her eyes suddenly filled with tears she had been holding back all day. "Can I see them?" she asked hesitantly. The doctor nodded and gestured toward the hallway. "Just for a moment. They asked for you." Shadow walked beside her, ears perked, tail low, sensing the importance of the moment. The room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors. Both officers lay wrapped in warm blankets, their faces still bruised but much more alive than when Emily had found them. The female officer opened her eyes first and smiled weakly. "There she is, our hero." Emily stepped closer, feeling her cheeks warm. "I'm not a hero," she whispered. "Shadow is." The male officer let out a gentle laugh that turned into a wince. "No," he said, voice raspy. "You both are. Without you, we wouldn't be here." Emily lowered her gaze, humbled by their gratitude. Shadow moved closer to their beds, sniffing gently at their hands. The officers each reached out slowly, petting him with weak but grateful touches. "Thank you, buddy," the man whispered. "You didn't give up on us." Shadow wagged his tail softly, his eyes warm and gentle. The female officer looked at Emily again. "You were brave beyond your years. Not many adults could do what you did today." Emily swallowed hard, trying to stay composed. "I just didn't want you to die," she said quietly. The woman squeezed her hand. "And because of you, we didn't." A soft knock came at the door, a nurse reminding them the officers needed rest. Emily nodded, understanding. Before leaving, she turned back to them. "Get better soon," she whispered. The officers exchanged a grateful glance. "We will," the woman said. "Thanks to you and Shadow." Emily walked out slowly, Shadow following close behind her. As the door closed gently behind them, Emily felt a warmth in her heart that no storm could ever take away. 2 lives were saved, and she and Shadow had been the reason. The next morning, the storm finally calmed, leaving the town wrapped in a soft blanket of snow. News trucks and reporters gathered outside the hospital, buzzing with questions. Word had already spread about the unbelievable rescue, how a little girl and her loyal police-trained dog had found 2 officers buried alive in the woods. Emily stood quietly near the entrance, holding Shadow's leash, overwhelmed by all the attention. She wasn't used to cameras or flashing lights. Shadow stayed close to her side, alert but calm, sensing the crowd's excitement. When the officers were wheeled out for a brief press update, reporters fell silent. Both wore warm jackets over their hospital gowns, still weak but smiling. The female officer pointed at Emily. "That little girl and that dog saved us," she said loudly enough for the cameras to hear. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The male officer nodded, his voice steady. "We were left to die. If Emily and Shadow hadn't found us when they did..." He paused, glancing at the girl with deep gratitude. "We wouldn't be standing here today." A reporter leaned forward. "Emily, how did you know where they were?" Emily hesitated, glancing down at Shadow. "I didn't," she admitted. "Shadow did. He felt something was wrong, so I followed him." The crowd murmured in amazement. Another reporter asked, "Weren't you scared?" Emily nodded softly. "Yes, really scared. But they needed help." The simplicity of her answer touched everyone listening. Even seasoned journalists blinked rapidly, trying to hide their emotion. Shadow wagged his tail, nudging Emily gently as if saying he was proud of her. As the officers were moved back inside, the police chief stepped forward and knelt beside Emily and Shadow. "Bravery comes in many forms," he said warmly. He reached into his coat and pulled out two small medals, one shaped like a silver star, the other shaped like a palm. These are for extraordinary courage. Emily's eyes widened as he pinned the star gently onto her jacket. Then he placed the palm medal on Shadow's collar. The crowd erupted into applause. Shadow let out a soft bark of appreciation, and Emily hugged him tightly. When they returned home, the world felt different, quieter, safer, brighter. Emily sat on the porch steps, watching Shadow play in the snow like any normal dog again. She smiled, knowing the truth. He wasn't just her pet, he was a hero. Later that evening, when their doorbell rang, Emily opened it to find a handwritten note from the officers. "You didn't just save our lives, you changed them. Thank you." Emily held the note close to her heart, and beside her, Shadow rested proudly, her partner, her protector, her miracle.